Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Gas prices are up again, and there are precious few consumers of gas who are happy about it. Producers, on the other hand, are probably quite pleased. I'm not here today to speak good or evil of the price of gas. I do, however, want us to learn a thing or two about what causes this. Because so often, just about every time the price of gas goes through a time of spiking high, we can always count on there being a good amount of grumbling from the people acting as though this is the result of terrible, awful, greedy, evil oil executives. That's why prices are so high. They can charge whatever they want. Yada, 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 yada. Well, is that true? Can they charge whatever they want? Well, let me ask this question. Before you answer, if they could charge whatever they want, why are prices not always high? Or why are prices not higher than they are right now? If they could charge whatever they want, then why not charge $1 billion a gallon? Oh, because no one would buy it at that price. Well, that's right. The price of gas is not a function of the particular level of the greed of oil executives on a particularly given day. But there's another common misunderstanding of it out there that's even more political. I've seen multiple posts on social media that essentially, show the price of gas or how much it costs to fill up someone's tank. And the message is very simple. It just says, "Thanks, Joe." Thanks, Joe. Right, this snarky accusation that I'm in pain for having to pay this much for gasoline, and the person who is at fault is Joe Biden. Now, that's closer to the truth than the oil executives for this reason. President Biden, one of the first things he did in office was to put the kibosh on the Keystone Pipeline, which reduced supply. And as long as demand stays the same and supply is reduced, prices will go up. But it's not as though Joe Biden wakes up in the morning and says, well, I think I'd like gas to cost this much today. Maybe tomorrow we'll drop it $1. It's not how things work. It's not how they can work. Even, again, conservatives misunderstand this. Just recently, there was some anger expressed by Vice President Harris, who was dealing with potential increases in taxes to big businesses. And someone, communicated to her, well, the big businesses will just pass along those costs to their consumers. And Vice President Harris was like, oh, how terrible. It's awful, awful, awful. It makes me so mad. Well, again, it's not that simple. If they could just pass their higher costs onto the consumers, then they would. They wouldn't have to wait for a higher tax in order to do that. If they're free to set their own prices, then why wait for a tax hike to raise prices? And the problem is, when prices go up, demand goes down. And when demand goes down, sales go down. It's not that complicated. It's not that complicated at all. Now, when the government gets involved and muddies things up, it really does muddy things up, but it doesn't change the fundamental nature of what's going on. So that, again, let's say the federal government says every corporation in a country that has over 100 employees will now have to pay an additional $1 million a year in taxes. And you say, oh, well, we'll just pass that along to the consumer. Well, for, I don't know, company X, widget making company X, that $1 million would mean that they'd have to, if they sold the same number of widgets, they'd have to increase the price of widgets by $20. Now everybody who's looking at a widget, instead of paying $5 for a widget, is thinking about having to pay $25 for a widget. And maybe they won't buy it. Maybe they'll do without. Maybe they'll make their old widget last a little longer. Maybe they'll go halvesies on widgets with their neighbor. By the way, in case you don't know, a widget is not a real thing. It's a made-up word to describe, to serve as an illustration, an economic illustration. So that's not what happens. Now, it's true that if you increase taxes and a company now has its profit margin damaged, that they may, in fact, just end up going out of business. If I can't sell my widgets for $25 because no one's going to pay that much, and if in order for me to make a profit I got to sell them for $25, well, I'm going to have to find something else to do. So what happens is, instead of taxing the consumer, instead of taxing the producer, you end up putting the company out of business. Oh, mercy. I don't think, I really don't think, even with respect to the vice president, I don't think these people are that stupid. I just think they don't care. I think that posturing yourself as the hero of the downtrodden by coming after the wealthy is somehow good for the election business. And that's why they say these kind of things. I know, for instance, that the whole idea of minimum wage laws are so simple to understand. It's the same basic principle. You pass a law that says you can't pay less than X, then everybody who values a laborer less than X is now not going to hire them. You can't change how people value certain goods or services on the basis of what you think they should be taxed at or what you think they should be paid for. That's why the market decides. That's why the market should decide when it's not distorted by government intervention. Now, we have been, over the years, doing a segment years ago, actually, we started called Economics in this lesson. And this is something that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to help you see the connection between basic sound economic theory. This is not something weird that I'm bringing to you. This is not some abstract, left field kind of ideology that I'm bringing. It's just, again, supply and demand. You can be a Keynesian and get this. You can be a communist and get this. You can be whatever you want and still get this. It just makes sense. It's how people behave. But one of the things that distorts how we behave is not just government, but our own foolishness, our own selfishness, our own refusal to grasp that wishing things were different won't make them different. The idea that we can legislate away the laws of the created order is the profound hubris that leads to economic destruction. I remember years ago, 30 years ago or more, reading a book that included an actual letter that a woman had written to her congressperson, insisting that the congressperson introduce legislation repealing the law of supply and demand. You understand the law of supply and demand is not a legal thing. It is a nature of reality thing, like the law of gravity. And you can no more get rid of the law of supply and demand than you can get rid of the law of gravity. And if you try, in either instance, someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to come crashing down to the ground. So friends, learn some basic things. Just law of supply and demand is simply this: if supply goes up and demand stays the same, price goes down. If price goes up and demand stays the same, as price goes up, demand decreases and supply should increase. It just makes sense. When things are more expensive, you buy less of them. When things are less expensive, you buy more of them. That doesn't mean that you buy things you don't want at all, but it does mean you make decisions. They're impacted by prices. So back to gas. You want to know who's responsible for the price of gas? You want to know who to blame that it costs you so much to fill up your gas tank right now? It's not the oil executives. It's not even ultimately President Biden. The person you need to be angry with is you. Because you're willing to pay what you pay. You're agreeing to pay what you pay. You may not like it. Of course, we all like to get everything for free, wouldn't we? But you volunteer. No one's making you do it. Oh, but I need to. Yeah, that's how important it is. That's why you're willing to pay that much. But if maybe you, rode your bike, took fewer trips, got a smaller car, did this, did that, it would help. It wouldn't cost so much. But you haven't made that decision either. So, look in the mirror. When the price of something is painful for you, it simply means it's more than you would like to pay. But if you're paying it, it's what you're willing to pay. There's no need to get aggravated. There's no need to get agitated. There's no reason to complain. And certainly no reason to run to the government and say, fix it, fix it. When you go into the marketplace and you look for work, don't you, generally speaking, look for an opportunity that will pay you more than the other opportunities? Of course, there are other things besides money, job satisfaction and things of that sort, hours and things. But the trade-off, you're always going to try to get the most you can get. And there's not a thing in the world wrong with that. And when Exxon comes into the marketplace, or British Petroleum comes into the marketplace, and they're offering not to sell their labor, but to sell the product of their labor, which is gasoline, they're going to want to get as much as they can. And they're going to do it by finding the people who are willing to pay. So, basic economics. And again, just grasping a few points will just soothe your spirit, calm you right down. You won't be quite so agitated. So learn a thing or two, and don't forget when you watch those headlines or go to the gas station and hear that ding ding as the cost keeps getting higher and higher. We come now in our ongoing series, The Bible in 5 Minutes, to the book of Titus. This is yet another epistle from the Apostle Paul, probably written in the mid-60s, between Paul's first imprisonment and his second imprisonment. Titus was a co-worker of Paul's who was given some authority to help in the church in Crete. And Titus was left there by Paul to help teach the new church. But when Paul left, the church, I wouldn't say welcomed in, had to struggle with the coming in of false teachers, which is a very common problem that Paul is addressing with. Now, there's not a lot of clarity or specificity with respect to what it was these false teachers were teaching, though it suggests mildly that it's connected to the same old issue of circumcision and Jewish law and the place of Gentiles and Jews. And the way Paul deals with this issue in the book is he draws a profoundly tight connection between faith and practice, between what we are called to believe and what we are called to do. And so this is a book that's just chock full of examples of how our life flows out of our doctrine. Now, in the context of doing that, of course, Paul, once again, as he had done earlier in letters to Timothy, he is giving some background on the qualifications for a leader in the church. What is the elder supposed to be like? And we have that listing in 2 Timothy, and we have a listing here in Titus as well. But one of the things that is so central in both of those lists, and this is why we've emphasized this with respect to the Shepherd's College, is that these are character issues. That these are things that are not something you can simply pick up by reading a book of sound doctrine. These are character issues, and he wants elders to be men of character so that they can then know how to lead the church well, to deal with and handle error. Now, that does require some knowledge. I'm not disputing any of that. But the idea that all you need to do is know what's true is not true. Now, Paul also, in a sense, gives Titus a kind of picture of what a healthy church should look like in describing these things. And in doing so, he helps us remember the blessings that come along with the gospel. It's not simply or just you get your soul saved so that when you die, you go to heaven instead of hell. Rather, the gospel produces in believers increasing godliness. It changes how we live. And ultimately, it is what we do that proves or disproves whether or not we actually know God. That's why it's so important to have godly men serving as elders and pastors. Now, what do we mean by godly men? Well, one thing we don't mean is men without sin. We have a high priest that fits that description. We have a great shepherd who fits that description. But the great shepherd and the high priest has ordained that we have local earthly elders in our churches. And those people are all going to be sinners. But are they sinners who look to God for his grace, for his forgiveness? So often, because we're so comfortable sort of comparing ourselves to others, we tend to think that, well, hey, if the pastor has committed a sin worse than any of the sins I've committed, then that means he's not godly. Not at all. Not at all. Think about, well, the closest thing we had in the first century to a human earthly shepherd. That would be Peter. The Peter who denied the Lord 3 times. The Peter who received the Lord's grace and forgiveness, but then just years later, having been used by God to bring in Cornelius, the first Gentiles, Peter caves into this circumcision party, refuses to eat with Gentiles, and receives a fitting and appropriate rebuke from the Apostle Paul. And yet he still was called to continue to minister, because in each instance, Peter's response to his failures was repentance. We need to remember that. This gives us the ability to deal with doctrinal and moral errors in the church without destroying the church. So, Paul writes to Titus, lifts him up, encourages him, and I'm sure the church at Crete was blessed by it as well.
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.